Good day. Klaus Wittkuhn and I met through the ISPI conferences. We've known each other longer than either one of us would care to admit. He's presented at ISPI and other conferences, and he's published in both Performance Improvement Journal and Performance Improvement Quarterly. Klaus was the first person to earn ISPI's Geary Rummler Award for the advancement of performance improvement. I wanted to ask him to share his work with us. In particular, I wanted to learn more about his use of Geary Rummler and Alan Brache's 9 boxes as part of a needs assessment. Klaus has also reserved plenty of time to answer your questions. Our idea is more of a dialogue than a traditional lecture with questions answered and answers afterwards. Klaus, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm delighted also. So let's say an official thank you again to you and Bob that you invited me. It was quite a surprise, but because of the personal connection to the topic, I was really pleased that you asked me, and I'm happy to do this. So I see that we are a small group. Hello to everybody. As Steve already announced, I prepared a presentation, obviously, but being a small group, I think the easiest way to do it is whenever a question pops up in your mind, simply ask, and then the whole thing might, what Steve just said, might develop more into a dialogue than being a lecture. So what you see here on the slide, I will talk about Rummler's 9 boxes. At the very end, I will make a little bit of connection to the project you are doing with Youth Help. And I am from Bonn in Germany. So what you see here, the photos, this is a little impression of the city and here of its artwork, because one of the most famous citizens we have is Beethoven. Just to give you an impression, Bonn is a very small city. It's 300,000 people, although it used to be the former capital of Western Germany, but it's really small. It's nice, high quality of living. And you see, we have a wide range from a musician over, Karl Marx. He studied in Bonn. He was famous for his drinking also, some small excesses when he was younger. And then lately, one of the very famous guys here is in mathematics and game theory, Reinhard Selten, who was awarded the Nobel Prize also. So that gives you a little bit an idea of where I come from. And before we start, I would like to ask you the following. Please memorize what you see here. I will come back to this at the end of the presentation. And then if you can't answer my question, you have to listen to it again. So this will be the final assessment today to tell me what you see here. Now, going into our topic, what I prepared is first to give a little bit an overview over the 9 boxes model of Rummler, then to make the connection between the model and consulting projects. I try to outline, where do you find this thinking? Where do you find those 9 boxes in consulting projects and in how consulting projects are set up? Because I think this provides a better understanding, like bridging the model and real work. And finally, we will make some connections to the project with Youth Help. I'm so happy to be invited because I really have a personal connection to it. I met Rummler, I think, even before I met you, Steve. And Rummler certainly was, when it comes to consulting, he was my most important teacher. And then over the years, he became my mentor, we made friends, and then our companies partnered and we did projects together. And the two of us have taught consultants that came from all over the world for many years. So we had a really close connection, and he unfortunately passed away way too early. But therefore I have this personal connection to his work also. And when I talk about where do you find it in consulting, I can also talk about projects we did together. So I'm quite sure that I can talk about it in the sense that he thought about it also. So coming to the 9 boxes model. Here, the very simplified version is this. It's like a matrix. You have organization, process, and job, or job performer. This is how you find it in his book. Across the columns, and here in the lines, you have goals, design, and management. And what the matrix basically tells us is, when it comes to organization, and you can have in mind a whole organization, like a whole company, or an organizational unit, like a business line or something, this does not make a difference. So when you think of organization, what is important when you want to understand it and help it to improve, an organization has to have goals, the first line. It has to be designed appropriately to be able to deliver on its desired results, like its strategy. This is a design question. Behind this thinking is very much the belief that performance is a result of proper design. And it has to be managed, because whatever isn't taken care of, sorry, deteriorates. So management is quite important. Now, the 3 columns you see are levels of performance. Rummler makes a distinction when he said, when you want to understand the performance of an organization, you have to understand that there are different levels of performance, and they influence each other, but it's not like they build on each other. So to a large extent, they are independent from each other, although they influence each other and have to be aligned. And therefore, what you see here is basically this thinking of the performance level, and says the most important performance level are the organization itself, the processes, especially the core processes of the organization, and then the jobs in the organization. And for each of those 3 levels of performance, you need to have performance goals. You have to design those levels, which means design organization, design processes. You might remember, like during the last 25, 30 years, we had this huge wave of process redesign, because companies realized after some time that they had those functional silos, and that value creation happens horizontally across those silos, and this is process. And therefore they started focusing on processes. And then finally, work is done either by machines, robots, software, or by people. So you have jobs in those processes where work is done. What you see, if you look at it, this is really taking a perspective to understand a whole organization. It's not like going in, and I do a little bit of caricature and say, going in and say, do you have any problems? And then pick one and try to improve it. The idea behind this is you get a rather comprehensive, complete understanding of the organization. And in the whole picture, then you can decide where does it make sense to come up with improvement efforts. This is the idea behind this simple matrix. And what you can see here in this graphic, you see the organization, you see the gray boxes, organizational units, you see the processes going across those units, and in those processes, you have jobs. In those old graphics, it shows little people, but in fact, it's not really about people. It might be software, it might be a machine doing the work there, and the idea is, even on job level, you are talking about a system that you have to look at. You do not look simply at people. This is attribution error, fundamental attribution error, that when something happens that is not desired, people tend to attribute to people as causes. But in many cases, this is not true. And Rummler, as well as Deming in his publications in the 50s, when he wrote about quality management, Deming also in the 50s wrote 70 to 80% of the problems in organizations are not connected with people. Management attributes it very quickly to people. But when you look for real causes, you don't find them with people, which means there's still like 20 to 30% people issues, which is huge. But when you go in as a consultant and you think statistically, probability, the higher probability is you find relevant causes that are not connected to people. So as a rule of thumb, when we do consulting projects and when we train consultants, we always tell them, look at people last. The odds are high that you do not find big lever there. So those are the performance levels. And you can imagine they have to be aligned. There are jobs being done along processes. So when you have what you see in the matrix, if you have goals, let me jump ahead of it. If you have goals for jobs, those job goals have to be aligned with process goals because, they follow in sequence. And they finally have to support process goals. Your process goals have to be aligned with your organizational goals. So there is a connection, but it's not like job goals or job results add up to process results and process results add up to organizational results. This is not true. I give you a very simple, it looks stupid when I give the example, but it illustrates right to the point what is the issue behind it. Imagine Mercedes produces cars in the southern part of Germany, and they want to speed up how they deliver their cars to Cologne. Now, the delivery is you take the car, drive it on a truck, the truck goes to the harbor, then the car goes on a ship, the ship goes up Neckar, Rhine to the Cologne harbor. There the car goes on a truck again to the local dealership, and it takes 8 days. Now, they wanted to speed it up considerably, and they come up with a training program, and they can show that the training program, they can show with hard figures, the training program is highly efficient and successful. Like people who used to drive 50 cars on a truck before the training, drive 100 cars on the truck after the training. So performance goes up enormously when it comes to this job. Still, now the truck takes the same time to the ship, putting the trucks on the ship takes the same time. So it's still 8 days. So improving a job performance does not automatically lead to improving process performance. Now in Germany, what you can do is all universities have little offices where students look for work. You can call them and say, we need somebody with a driver's license. And then you get a student, you hand him the key of a brand new $200,000 Mercedes-Benz convertible and tell him, drive this car to Cologne overnight, 4 hours. So process performance, like the time to deliver, goes from 8 days to 4 hours, and you haven't touched anybody in the process, basically. What you did is you took a completely redesigned process, a different, and then your process performance goes up. Now, everything has two sides. You might not want to hand the keys of a brand new expensive car to a student at night. So this does not say it's a good solution, but it illustrates job performance does not add up to process performance automatically. And process performance does not add up to organizational performance. Just for time reasons, I don't want to continue with illustrations for that now, but it's the same issue behind it. Nevertheless, they have to be aligned. This is important. So, and the other thing is, now you need those objectives, the goals for all those three, for job and process and organizational level, and align them. This is the first line in the matrix. Second line is design. Now, this is what I already said. You can say, think of an organization as a machine. A machine functions as it is designed, assuming it doesn't break down. It's performance by design. You can think of an organization in the very same way. Now, this is an analogy that emphasizes certain aspects. It certainly falls short when it comes to other aspects, but you could look as an organization and say, yes, the results an organizations deliver are exactly the ones that are built into the design of the organization. Come up with a flawed design and you will not get the results you want to see. And therefore, organizational design is quite important. The same thing is for processes. You can make processes enormously complicated, cumbersome, long, that it makes it prone to mistakes. It takes more time, so process performance goes down when you do this. So streamlining processes brings process performance up. And this is a design question also. And the same is true for jobs. If you look at job not as this is the performer there, but it is the job, then the question is, how good is the job design? A flawed job design will lead to flawed job performance. And then you have to check more elements like, are there clear performance objectives in place? Is performance monitored? Is corrective action taken when something does not happen? Are the necessary resources in place to do this job? If people do the job, do they get the necessary support? Are they onboarded properly? All those things influence performance on the job level. So on the job level also, it needs clear objectives, but also it needs a good design of jobs. You can see this when you certainly have seen, at least on TV, how a production line in automotive companies functions. This is so well designed, whatever people do is thought through in advance, including the resources they need and everything. And this is what I mean with job design. And this is behind the job level of performance in Rummler's thinking. So although we see those little people here, this is one of his original graphics. But it's not really about people. It's about this little system that defines the job. So design is important on all levels. And then finally, management. And what you have to see when you want to understand this model is, management is a function in the organization also. But when it comes to this matrix, it means more like the activity of managing the organization, managing the processes, and managing the jobs. This is, it's connected with the function, but it's the activity of doing it. This is the meaning of those 9 boxes here. Mm-hmm. And the thinking is, every model simplifies things, otherwise it wouldn't be a model. You get a one-to-one model would be reality. So yes, it simplifies things, obviously. But the idea behind it is, if you think that way, if you think in those 9 boxes, you get a good comprehensive understanding of the organization and how things are connected. And when you do an analysis, you are able to see where are shortcomings that enable us to improve the organization. And then you can look at consulting projects. You have them in different sizes. Organizations can ask you in, and they have a very specific, well-defined problem that they want to solve. Then you do not need those 9 boxes. You do not need to look at the whole organization. This might be small projects at work. Mm-hmm. If you take an approach that looks at comprehensive parts of the organization, then I think you always should check the 9 boxes in the background, because one of the assumptions behind it is also organizations are systems, which means if you change a big part in the system, you can expect, that this influences other parts, and maybe in a way that you did not desire, because you did not check, you did not understand the connections. So therefore, if you go in on a bigger scale, then the 9 boxes make sense. If it's a small, limited project, then it's probably overdoing.
Klaus?
Yes, please.
In my experience, organizations vary dramatically in terms of the alignment of those 9 boxes. So I've done consulting work in some manufacturing settings. And as you mentioned, that production line, there was a lot of alignment across management, design, goals, across the organization, the process, and the jobs. I've also worked with other organizations, primarily non-manufacturing ones, where I don't often see that kind of alignment. By and large, management kind of does management things, but they're not necessarily in charge of the design of the operation, the process, the job. They're not they may be setting goals, but they largely don't know what the processes are. They don't know how people actually get the work done. And is that the same in your experience too, where
Yes.
some organizations are really aligned and others have a lot of alignment issues?
Yes. Yes, it describes it perfectly. And I mean, it's kind of a historical development also. Bigger organizations that have gone through process re-engineering and quality management, they usually have a lot of alignment in the organization. But that meant they put a lot of effort into this. Developing a quality management system for a production company is really effort. And if you do process re-engineering there also. But this goes together then and produces alignment. But then you go in with quite comprehensive approaches to change things. Otherwise, if companies simply develop historically, and let's say they try, it's probably something like, don't fix things if they are not broken, as long as it works somehow, you don't touch it.
Yes.
And then one thing develops into this direction, one thing into that. Somehow they make it work, but it's far away from being efficient and being well aligned.
It's organic rather than engineered.
Yeah, you could say that, yes.
And
it grew over time.
We see, in my experience, I've seen that a lot in companies that started off and grew rapidly and now have hit an inflection point where what worked for them when they were small and lean and growing is now becoming increasingly cumbersome. I've seen it happen in nonprofit organizations where their real focus is always on the mission, and they often lack the internal resources to put infrastructure in place to align these components of the 9 boxes.
Yes, I fully agree.
This
is true for nonprofits. This is true for small companies also. They often do not have the resources to do this.
And the other thing that struck me as I heard you talk about the 9 boxes is, Gary Rummler left us with a host of different performance improvement tools. And it seems that the 9 boxes very closely align with Roger Kaufman's notion of separating out an initial needs assessment from a needs analysis. An initial needs assessment is a way of looking at a higher level of the organization. Darlene Van Teen might call it the environmental scan, the organizational analysis, some of the gap analysis. but this is the place that you start first, simply because you want to get a sense of the organization and the alignment of these components before randomly selecting a performance gap to focus on. Conversely, if it's a simpler organization and the problem is not as complex, the 9 boxes could be overkill.
Yes, could be, but otherwise I fully agree. This is where you start, what you just described. If you are not stuck in a very limited project.
And one of our project teams found a creative use for the 9 boxes. They were doing work with the Coast Guard, and they were looking at a problem the Coast Guard was having, finding qualified, building a pool of qualified candidates for the rescue people, the folks that actually get into the hazardous waters and save the people who are drowning. Mm-hmm. And they were having an issue finding and maintaining a pool of qualified candidates. And one of the things that they realized is that it was a process issue, and they used a mashup of Chevalier's BEM, but when they found that there were process issues, they also used the process column from the 9 boxes and looked at, do you have goals? Do you have design? Do you have management? And one of the things they found is that no one person or organization in the Coast Guard had a management span of control or accountability or authority for the overall process that begins way back in recruitment, that finally ends with a qualified rescue swimmer.
Yes.
So while this tool might primarily be something for an initial needs assessment, people might be able to use this tool in ways that might beef up some of the cause analysis or the needs analysis as well.
Yes, I will come back to what you just said. Cool. When we make the connection, where we find it in projects.
Thank you.
I think, yes, you are exactly right. The other thing, the Coast Guard example is a good example for what you see here on the slide, because this thinking, looking at a process performance level, you know, and you said value creation happens horizontally. Therefore, it's extremely important. Oh, yeah. This led to the idea to have process managers, you know, people being in charge of the whole process, although the process goes across many different units. Before that, the thinking was also always management positions sit in the units. Like if you are a team manager, then a department manager, then you have manager business line, whatever it is. But you go up in your silo, you know, until you are finally, if you make it, on the top level. And this thinking led to introducing process managers, you know, which was then across this as the silo thinking, which was quite a new idea then. And I mean, not that many companies did it, because you end up, matrix organizations are always a little difficult, you know. And then in huge organizations, you have matrices anyhow. Like people are responsible for regions and for marketing, you know, and you have the matrix responsibilities between regions and marketing and stuff like that. You already have it in place, and then on top of that, you kind of come up with the next dimension of matrix and say, now we have process managers. So it's not that easy to do, but certainly for the question of alignment, when you look at the importance of processes, it makes sense to have those guys in place. Okay, now, so far, to give a little bit of background on those 9 boxes and where they come from, you know, what is the sense behind it? Then where do you find it in consulting projects? We never use the 9 boxes as the 9 boxes in a consulting project. They are built into other tools. And the way this is done is you check at the highest level first. The first thing you do is you try to check, what does, respectively, what should the organization deliver? This is basically the goals on the organizational level. And you do this, I mean, you check their reports, you talk to their stakeholders, you talk to their customers, you know, you do a comprehensive scan, collect those perspectives, and then you get an idea to what extent do they deliver on their organizational goals. And this might give you already a hint, although you do not look really into the organization. You interview customers and stakeholders and say, you know, you take an outside perspective, you scan the environment, but it already might give you hints what might be wrong inside the organization. Because if you are experienced in consulting and, you know, those people tell you about certain problems, you immediately develop hypotheses where it might come from. Now, a hypothesis can be wrong. You have to verify this during the process, but you start there. Once you have this, you start looking into the organization. And because value creation goes across organizational units, the best thing is you start with the processes. And then again, you look at the process goals, like what are they? And you try to make up your mind, what should those process goals be to be perfectly aligned with organizational goals and to make processes efficient and effective. You know, and then you might see gaps, but when it's important, what you do in any case is you map, analyze, and improve the process design. Because you can bet your year's salary. If you face an organization that never has done process redesign, the biggest leverage you find is most probably there. And therefore, simply as a kind of a statistical guide, you know, better let's look at this, because otherwise we might concentrate on things that are minor in comparison to the improvements we can gain here. And then the management thing is always important. And then you look at process management, like, are there KPIs? You know, if they have goals, are they translated into KPIs that are monitored and that finally end up being information for management so that they can manage the process? Because no matter how good the process is designed or redesigned in a project, if it's not properly managed, it will deteriorate again. So those are you could say, the second big step you take. And because processes are so decisive for the performance of an organization, only in the third step, you look at organizational structure. Because then, if you have an understanding of the processes, you can look at it and say, how should organizational units be designed to be as little a barrier to process performance as possible? You know, there is no perfect solution. There are always trade-offs, but you try to find something where you say, we don't want to end up in having those hard silos again, you know, and build in barriers into process performance by design. You cannot completely avoid it, but it depends very much on how you design those units. And therefore, when we worked, process performance as a rule of thumb and process understanding always comes before organization understanding. And therefore here, in the first step, we only check organizational goals, desired results. We do not look at how it is organized already, because this is what we do after processes are understood. And then it's the same thing. You know, you look at org design, is and should, you map it, you analyze it, you make improvement, like redesign suggestions, and you have to see what are the KPIs then in those organizational units aligned with process KPIs, and they have to be monitored, translated into management information so that they have a data-based management approach. So, and once you have this, understanding, then you can see here, you already see many KPIs that are helpful for the organization. Then you check the management system. And so do they have a management system in place? And I quickly show you an example of what we mean when we talk about a management system. But then you look at it, you can map it, analyze it, and improve it also. This is the design of the management system then. And the last thing is, you look at job level, and not at all of them. You try to identify success critical ones, you know, because I mean, all this is effort. And then you have to see, there is kind of a limit to it where you say the marginal contribution of what you get out of it is so little that it's not worth the effort anymore. So people come rather late in the process when they are connected with the jobs. And as a rule of thumb, what I already mentioned, we try to train consultants and tell them, look at people last. You know, look at job last, and then when you look at the jobs, look at people last. Now, let me quickly give you an impression of a management system. What you see here, down here, you see organizational units like function A, function B, function C. You see a process going through those organizational units, and this is where work is done. Value is created here. Now, the management system sits on top of it to manage it, and you can describe it and what you know. There's a plan, do, check, adapt. To make it fit the graphic, you know, we moved the 4 parts of the circle a little around. Because if you look at the management system, what you need is, whoop, what was that? What you need is, you need a part that plans performance, which is define objectives, identify the resources and the support that is needed to achieve those objectives. And then you have to develop plans for the organization, like annual plans. How do we achieve our objectives? And in those plans, you also define the KPIs. How do you monitor whether you are on track or not? And this planning box informs down here the processes and the units on what should be done. Then what you need is, you have to collect data. Those are those green lines. And all this data that you collect in monitoring performance feeds into this box where you check performance, which means you collect the data, you translate the data into management information, and then you analyze whether there are deviations from what you defined here in those planning boxes. And once you have done that, what you need is a box that you could say adapt performance, because if there are deviations, you have to identify the causes of those deviations. You have to identify and define what is the necessary corrective action, and you have to take it. And the management system can be broken anywhere in here. I have seen management systems that put enormous effort into planning, and after planning, nothing happened again, you know, except for planning the next year. So all the other parts were missing, or they collect piles of data, but they fall short in translating it into management information. I once talked to a general manager of a company. He had like books, monthly reports, like books in the shelf behind him, and he just took over the job. And he pointed to the books and says, guess what? All my predecessors came up with new requirements. So, and I end up having monthly reports that are books, and I don't even know what to do with all this information. So it, you know, it can break down wherever. Often it breaks down here. There's no systematic way to identify and take corrective action. And then you can see there's only 2 ways of taking corrective action. One thing is, if your objectives are still okay, then you do not have to touch your objectives. Then the way you work has to be improved. if you don't meet the objectives. But you can have situations where you do not get the desired results because your objectives are not appropriate anymore. Think of the financial crisis in 2008. You know, your objectives simply were not realistic anymore in some companies. So it was not about improving the work. It was about adapting the objectives to the changed environment. So it's either or both, but it's only those two directions where corrective action can go. And this is what is meant with a management system. You know, then when you go into an organization and check a management system, you check all those boxes that you see here on the slide and try to find out not whether they are perfect. Nothing is perfect in the real world, but, you know, has it been developed to an extent that is appropriate to be able to manage this organization? This is what we are looking for then. And with all those things, this is not only true for the management system, this is true for everything in this methodology. What Steve mentioned, Gary and we in our company also, we develop tons of tools how to do those things. So we can support people with templates, with process descriptions, you know, with, I mean, whatever is needed to do it in a systematic way. Because it has been applied to so many projects, you know, in all those projects, it's a little bit like what you know in aviation. You know, if there's an accident with a plane, it's analyzed and then it goes into the manuals and the guides for the pilots. Now, in the old days, they used to have a shelf behind them with binders, with all this stuff, and a flight engineer. So those days are gone. Meanwhile, all this stuff is on laptops, but it's still there. And this methodology thinks very much the same way. Each project is used to improve and to fine-tune the tools that are existing. And meanwhile, this is a gigantic library. So far to the 9 boxes with a specific emphasis on, let's go back, how do you find this in project design when you do consulting? Because in the project, you do not go box by box, you know, it's not the boxes that guide the sequence of your work. The work is organized differently, but the 9 boxes are in the background, like a blueprint behind it. And then with the second special emphasis on what I said, what is extremely important is management. And this always comes down to management system. So there is no comprehensive project consulting a company or an organization without checking the management system. Because whatever you do, if the management system is flawed and has gaps, it will deteriorate very quickly. Okay, then. So all in all, it's a little bit like looking at organizations is a little tricky. And of course, what I showed you are models. So they make things simpler than they are in reality. So it's kind of, you take them as a generic approach, and then you have to adapt them. In each project, you make slight changes in your models and your tools, because it finally has to fit the organization you are working with. So let's come back to this. This was the initial question we started with. What is this? It's not that important. You only can fail this lecture, not your whole study, but
I mean, initially I wanted to say an apple, but I think more of like, it's what the person was looking at the beginning, what their eyes were on.
Yeah. I mean, you are on a, let's say, your thinking goes in the right direction, because basically what you do is that, I mean, this question is so stupid, there has to be some kind of trick behind it, right?
That's why I was like, it's an apple, but I've already failed.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, right. So it can't be an apple. So you are quite right with that. Now, the connection to this lecture is because whatever you do, you cannot see an organization. So the only way to make things visible is to have models, and those models guide you. Although you know models make you see certain things, this is the fit part, but models make things vanish also. So you always have to be aware of this. And I think this is one of the difficulties for both sides, for consultants when they learn their job, and sometimes also for managers when they work with consultants, because what happens is, imagine people working for McKinsey, the brightest of the brightest, and additionally well-trained at McKinsey, and then they go into companies and work with managers who have been doing their jobs for 25 years. And then those youngsters have the feeling we know better because we have been well-trained. But of course, they have been trained of models, you know, and those experienced guys think they don't know what they are talking about. You know, I have been doing this for 25 years, and in a certain respect, both are right. So the question is, you know, how do you make them meet and take advantage, you know, of the advantage of the other perspectives? Now, and if you bring this together, this model thinking, then look at this. This is not an apple. This is what you immediately knew. What this is this is a painting from Magritte, which is a Belgian painter. And Ceci n'est pas une pomme says this is not an apple. Now, in this case, it's not even a painting. You know, what we see is kind of a digital representation of a photo of this painting. So we are several levels away from what used to be what it's kind of an apple. In some cases, we do not have a problem with those different levels being away from reality. If you see a homicide on TV, you don't call the police. If you look at the menu, you do not confuse what you read in the menu with the real meal. Although the menu is kind of a representation of it, like our models are representations of the. So in some cases, it seems to be obvious for us. In other cases, it's much less obvious. And therefore, I love this Apple example so far, because using models, and we can't do without them, using models is kind of tempting. They seduce us into believing this is reality, but it's not. Reality always is more than that. And it's messier and muddier than what any model can show us. And there was a Polish philosopher in the 1920s who said it quite good. I think this is the most concise way of saying it. The map is not the landscape. And do not confuse those two things. And therefore, I believe very much in the methodology. You know, Rummler was my most important teacher when it comes to consulting. But in this case also, what is true is, no matter how good the tools are, those are maps. And you always have to be kind of observing what you are doing and checking, is this really appropriate? Or is there anything that I overlook? Is my map really appropriate for what I want to achieve here?